April 12, 1946. The dawn over the Kansas plains came pale and thin, like a breath held too long. Frost crusted the fences of the camp, rows of silver wire strung between wooden posts that had once marked the boundary between enemies and protectors. Inside, the wind carried the smell of oatmeal from the mess hall and the faint sound of a radio playing softly in the guardhouse. A group of women, 30 in all, gathered in the yard, shivering in government-issue coats that hung too large on their small frames. They looked not like prisoners of war, but like a school of ghosts waiting for roll call. An officer stepped forward, cleared his throat, and read from a sheet of paper that trembled in his gloved hand. "You are all released." The words were supposed to feel like sunrise. Instead, silence. Then, one woman began to cry, quietly at first, like a leak in the heart. Another followed. Within moments, the yard filled with muffled sobs and bowed heads. The American officers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected relief, perhaps applause. They got grief. The man in charge, Captain Walter Hensley, was 35, with a sun-reddened face and the kind of neat posture drilled into soldiers who had spent too many nights under orders. He had seen battle in the Pacific, seen the kind of pain that erased identity. Yet nothing in that war had prepared him for the sight of these women, Japanese civilians, some widowed, some barely more than girls, clinging to each other like refugees from hope. He folded his paper, glanced at the translator beside him, and whispered, "They understood me, didn't they? The translator understood me, didn't they?" The translator nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why they cry." Behind the wire, life had been unexpectedly gentle. The camp, once a war relocation authority site, had been converted in late 1944 to hold captured civilians from Saipan and Guam. There had never been enough of them to justify new barracks, so they lived in the old classrooms where American teachers had once taught arithmetic to internees. The walls still bore chalk marks from lessons long gone. A blackboard read faintly, "Peace begins with understanding." No one had dared erase it. Over the months, the women had carved out small sanctuaries of routine. They worked in the laundry, tended a vegetable patch near the fence, and took English lessons from a Methodist volunteer named Mrs. Callahan, whose son had been killed at Iwo Jima. "You can hate war," she had told them gently, "without hating people." Her kindness confused them at first. They had been raised to believe the Americans were monsters, brutes who drank too much and shot for sport. Instead, the guards shared cigarettes, chocolate, and, when nobody reported it, magazines full of smiling movie stars. They learned new words slowly, tasting them aloud like secrets. Apple pie, kindness, tomorrow. Evenings, they sang Japanese lullabies mixed with American hymns. One of the women, a nurse named Aiko, once said that the fence outside her window felt less like a prison and more like protection from the chaos she imagined still raging beyond. Now that the war was over, still raging beyond. Now that the war was over, the United States wanted to clean its conscience and its ledgers. Operation Blacklist had begun months earlier, a vast effort to repatriate Japanese civilians and prisoners across the Pacific. Official memoranda framed it as closure. But closure meant loss to those who had built fragile new lives here. Captain Hensley read his orders twice that morning. All internees are to be transported to San Francisco within 72 hours for repatriation. The paper gave no instructions for tears. As the officers dispersed, Aiko stepped forward. She was 27, her hair neatly tied back with a ribbon sewn from scrap fabric. Her English was halting but clear. "Please, sir," she said softly, "we go home to what?" Hensley blinked. "To Japan, Mississippi. To your families." She shook her head. "Family all gone. Tokyo burned." The translator hesitated, then repeated her words aloud. The captain looked down at his boots, unable to meet her eyes. He had read reports. 9 million homeless, cities flattened, rice harvests decimated. But reports were numbers, not faces. Now the ruin had a voice. That night the women gathered in the barracks. Someone played a harmonica. A guard had left it behind, and the melody wove through the dimly lit room like smoke. Aiko sat near the stove, staring at her hands. "America is strange," she murmured in Japanese. "They feed us, clothe us, and call us enemy. And now they free us, and call it mercy." The others nodded. One woman laughed bitterly. "In Japan there will be no food, no beds. Only ghosts." Outside, Captain Hensley smoked alone by the fence. His sergeant joined him. "They're crying because they don't want to go," the sergeant said. "Can you imagine that?" Hensley didn't answer. He thought of the letters from home, the ones describing victory parades and rationed coffee. America had moved on. But here, within this small patch of guarded ground, something tender had survived the war, something fragile and inconvenient. The next morning, a Red Cross truck arrived with crates of blankets and canned peaches. A local woman from town brought a basket of bread, wrapped in wax paper. "For the ladies," she said simply, leaving it at the gate. The guards stared after her, uncertain whether to salute or thank her. The gesture felt sacred. Inside the mess hall, the women lined up for what they now knew was one of their final meals in America. Steam rose from tin trays, eggs, toast, and weak coffee. Aiko paused, folded her hands, and whispered a quiet prayer in Japanese. Across the table, Mrs. Callahan smiled faintly. "You'll be all right, dear," she said, patting her hand. "Home is where the heart heals." Aiko nodded politely but didn't reply. Her eyes lingered on the American flag above the kitchen door, fluttering softly in the draft. By afternoon, the camp was buzzing with preparation. Papers were signed, trunks packed, names checked off ledgers. But beneath the efficiency ran a current of quiet defiance. Several women had hidden small items in their luggage, postcards, sewing needles, a tin of cocoa powder, to remember this strange kindness. The guards pretended not to notice. At dusk, Aiko stood outside her barracks, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The prairie grass glowed gold in the fading light, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded. She imagined the long journey ahead, San Francisco, then across the sea to a homeland she might not recognize. Her breath clouded in the chill air. Behind her, another woman whispered, "Do you think they will forget us?" Aiko answered without turning, "No. But they will not understand why we cried." Captain Hensley walked past them, his silhouette tall against the evening. He paused at the gate and looked back at the women gathered near the fence, their faces half lit by the setting sun. Something inside him shifted, an understanding that wars end not with victory but with partings like this. He raised his cap slightly in farewell. None of them waved. They only watched, their eyes glassy with a mixture of gratitude and grief. The train whistle sounded again, closer this time, echoing through the empty plains like a reminder that the world was moving on, with or without them. Aiko looked toward the horizon and whispered one word, half in prayer, half in defiance, "Home." The wind carried it through the wire, into the open fields, where it dissolved among the frost. The sound was small, almost lost, but it lingered, soft and stubborn, like something refusing to end. The morning after the announcement, the camp seemed to breathe differently, quieter, heavier, as if even the wind had learned respect. The women moved through their routines in silence, though nothing about the day was ordinary. Some folded laundry with meticulous care, their hands trembling as they touched the coarse fabric of American uniforms. Others knelt in the dirt garden behind the barracks, tending the small green shoots that had miraculously survived the Kansas frost. To them, these sprouts weren't plants, they were proof that kindness could take root in unlikely soil. Captain Hensley watched from his office window, his coffee cooling untouched. His orders were simple: process the release, arrange transportation, report completion. But nothing about these women fit neatly into the military's columns and code. He saw them laugh softly when a guard's dog trotted by, their eyes warming with a tenderness that unsettled him. It reminded him of his wife's laughter before the war, something so ordinary it had once gone unnoticed. Now, it cut through him like music from another life. By noon, Mrs. Callahan arrived at the gate with her usual basket of bread and jam. She was 52, her hair streaked with gray and her posture straight as the hymnals she carried every Sunday to church. The guards called her the Saint of Block C, though she never saw herself that way. Her son's picture hung from a small locket around her neck, the same son who died in the Pacific. Yet here she was, bringing sweetness to the very people who once wore his enemy's flag. When she entered the women's barack, the air filled with the warm smell of yeast and soap. "Good morning, ladies," she said cheerfully. The women rose, bowing slightly. Iko stepped forward to translate. "Good morning, Mrs. Callahan," she said, her accent soft but steady. "We thank you always." Mrs. Callahan smiled. "You don't thank me, dear. You help me heal." She placed the basket on the table and began dividing slices of bread, her voice gentle. "Let's practice our English, shall we?" They gathered around her like children at a lesson. She pointed to objects, and they repeated in careful rhythm: bread, window, heart, hope. Some giggled at their mistakes, their laughter spilling into the room like sunlight through cracks. Iko noticed that laughter always seemed to surprise the guards. It wasn't supposed to exist here. Yet it did, stubborn and alive. The kindness that bloomed behind the wire was quiet, deliberate. It began with gestures too small for official reports. A sergeant slipped magazines through the fence. A medic shared aspirin for headache. The cook in the mess hall, a lanky man from Oklahoma, set aside extra sugar packets for the ladies who like their tea sweet. These weren't acts of policy but of conscience, tiny rebellions against the hatred that had fueled the war. For the women, every kindness was a puzzle. Japan had taught them to revere endurance, not comfort. Yet here, strangers treated them as women first and enemies second. It created a confusion that felt dangerously close to affection. One afternoon, as Iko mended a torn blanket, she said to her bunkmate Hannah, "When they smile, I forget I am prisoner." Hannah nodded. "And when I remember, it hurts." That evening, a storm rolled across the plains. Thunder cracked over the camp like artillery, and rain battered the rooftop. The women huddled together in the barracks, lighting candles to chase the shadows. Mrs. Callahan stayed with them, refusing to leave and chase the shadows. Mrs. Callahan stayed with them, refusing to leave until the storm passed. "You're safe here," she assured them, her voice steady over the roar. Outside, guards patrolled in slick ponchos, flashlights slicing through sheets of rain. Iko watched one guard stop near the fence, remove his coat, and drape it over the stray dog that had taken refuge beneath a wagon. She stared, stunned by the sight. "He protects even the animal," she whispered. Mrs. Callahan looked at her. "A good heart doesn't choose its mercy," she said. When the storm ended, the women sang. They sang softly at first, an old Japanese folk song about spring and forgiveness. Then, one of the younger women began humming "You Are My Sunshine," a tune she'd learned from a radio in the kitchen. Soon, the two melodies intertwined, foreign and familiar, blending into something neither nation could claim alone. Hensley, passing outside, stopped to listen. The sound rose through the camp like a prayer made of two languages, and for a moment, he imagined the barbed wire melting away. Days passed, and the routine became ritual. The women worked, sewed, studied English. A Red Cross nurse brought books, Dickens, Whitman, and a small pocket Bible. They practiced reading aloud in halting rhythm. Iko's favorite line came from Leaves of Grass: "I am large, I contain multitudes." She copied it carefully into her journal, unsure why it moved her so deeply. Sometimes humor slipped through the cracks. When a supply officer complained that the women kept returning their uniforms neatly ironed, Hannah replied politely, "We cannot give dirty things back to America." The men laughed, though none could quite tell if it was a joke or a quiet rebuke. Beneath the warmth, however, lay the ache of impermanence. The women knew their comfort was borrowed time. Iko often stared at the horizon during chores, watching the distant train tracks glint in sunlight. "That's the way home," she murmured once, "but it doesn't feel like home anymore." Mrs. Callahan overheard and said nothing. Some truths, she knew, were too sacred to answer. One afternoon, the local press arrived to photograph the camp for a post-war feature titled "Mercy After Victory." The journalist expected to find hardened faces. Instead, his camera captured women smiling beside American nurses, hands dusted with flour from a baking class. "It's like a school," he remarked. Hensley only said, "A school for forgetting war." The article never mentioned the tears after release. It didn't fit the narrative of triumph America preferred. When the news came that transport ships were ready, the air inside the camp thickened with quiet dread. The women folded their dresses and ration cards with ceremonial precision. Aiko sewed a small American flag from scraps of cloth, hiding it in her sleeve. "Not to betray," she told Hannah, "but to remember." On the final Sunday before departure, Mrs. Callahan organized a small gathering in the chapel hut. She read from the Gospel of Matthew, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Her voice faltered near the end. Then, she handed each woman a small paper cross, cut from hymnbook pages. "To carry light across the ocean," she said. That evening, Aiko visited the fence one last time. The sunset bled across the sky, staining the wire gold. On the other side, Captain Hensley stood with his cap in hand. "We'll miss your singing," he said quietly. Aiko bowed her head. "We will miss the fence," she replied. He frowned slightly, uncertain if he'd misheard. She looked up, eyes steady. It kept the world out. The moment hung between them, too fragile to touch. A whistle sounded from the station beyond the hill, the train that would take them west. The women began to pack in earnest, their laughter replaced by the rustle of fabric and paper. As night fell, Aiko blew out the candle beside her bunk. For the first time since her capture, the dark felt threatening again. Outside, the wind whispered through the wire, a faint metallic sigh that sounded almost like a goodbye. The mail arrived late that morning, bundled in twine and heavy with foreign stamp. A corporal carried it across the yard, his boots crunching over the frosted ground. The women stopped their chores, drawn by instinct more than curiosity. Every few months, a batch of letters from Japan made its way through Red Cross channels, censored, delayed, and sometimes half destroyed by rain or mishandling. But they came, ghosts in envelope. The corporal handed the stack to Captain Hensley, who read the sender names aloud, each syllable softened by distance. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the cold, listening for pieces of their old lives to surface. When Aiko's name was called, she pressed her palms together before taking the letter. The paper was thin and yellowed, its corners worn soft as cloth. Her hands trembled as if it might crumble under the weight of her touch. She carried it to the barracks without opening it, holding it against her chest like a fragile bird. Around her, others unfolded their own letters, their faces shifting between relief, confusion, and quiet despair. The room filled with the rustle of paper, like the whispering of lost years. Hours later, when the lanterns were lit, Aiko finally broke the seal. The letter was from her younger sister, Keiko, written months earlier. The words were small and deliberate. "Tokyo is ash. The house is gone. Father died of sickness after the bombing. I sleep in a church basement with other girls. We wait for rice, but there is little. Do not worry for me. Do not come back yet." The ink trailed off near the end, blurred by a tear that had dried into the paper. Aiko's breath caught. She read the lines again, slower this time, as if repetition might change them. In that moment, the warmth of the camp, the bread, the lessons, the kindness, collapsed into guilt. She had eaten while her sister starved. She had slept under a roof while her homeland lay in ruins. The candle beside her flickered, its light too soft to chase the images in her mind. Children scavenging, women queuing for water, soldiers limping through rubble. She closed her eyes, but the images stayed. Outside, Captain Hensley stood smoking by the gate, scanning the horizon as if the prairie might deliver answers. The translator, Lieutenant Yamada, a Nisei soldier born in California, joined him. "Letters came," he said quietly. "Bad news." Hensley nodded. "Every one of them, I think." Yamada hesitated. "You know, Captain, for them the going home is not freedom. It's starvation." Hensley exhaled a long stream of smoke that vanished into the dark. "And staying here isn't an option either." In the barracks, the air thickened with mourning. Hannah knelt beside Aiko, her own letter trembling in her lap. "My husband is alive," she whispered, her eyes hollow. "But he does not want me. He says Japan needs strong women, not broken ones." The words landed between them like stones. Aiko took her hand and squeezed gently. "We are not broken," she said, though her voice betrayed her doubt. The following days moved slowly, each one heavier than the last. Meals went uneaten. The English lessons fell silent. Even Mrs. Callahan, ever the optimist, noticed the change. "They look haunted," she told Hensley. "Like the war just arrived for them." He nodded but said nothing. The truth gnawed at him. The United States had given these women shelter, perhaps even kindness, but not belonging. Their bodies were safe, but their hearts were caught between two ruins. By the end of the week, a few women approached the gate with handwritten petitions. The letters were polite, written in careful English. "We ask to stay for work. We can clean, sew, cook. We ask not for money, only for a chance." The guard who collected them looked helpless, unsure where such pleas belonged. He handed them to Hensley, who placed them on his desk and stared at them for a long time. They weren't requests, he realized. They were confessions. They were confessions, evidence of fear wrapped in grammar. That night, rain swept through the plains again, drumming on tin roof. Inside the barracks, the women gathered around the stove, reading their letters aloud in broken whispers. Aiko's voice trembled as she reached the final line of hers. "If you ever come back, bring soap. It is the only thing that smells like life now." She pressed the paper to her lips, as if she could breathe her sister's scent from the ink. Mrs. Callahan entered quietly, holding a kettle of hot water. "Tea," she offered. No one answered. She sat beside Aiko and glanced at the letter. "Your sister." Aiko nodded. "She is hungry." Mrs. Callahan poured tea into a chipped mug and handed it to her. "Then let's not waste this," she said softly. "Drink for her." The simplicity of it broke something inside Aiko. She began to cry, not the polite tears of farewell, but deep, shuddering sobs that came from the part of her that still belonged to Tokyo's ashes. The other women joined her, the sound swelling until it filled the room like a hymn of grief. Hensley stood outside the door, listening. His hand tightened on the doorknob, then fell away. He couldn't face them, not tonight. Orders were orders. Yet he felt the weight of every syllable like a stain he couldn't wash out. When the sobbing quieted, he walked to his office and opened one of the petitions. The handwriting was delicate, the English almost perfect. It ended with a single sentence: "We do not fear freedom. We fear the emptiness that waits for us." A week later, a transport list arrived from headquarters. The repatriation schedule was fixed. San Francisco within days, then Yokohama by sea. The orders came with no room for appeal. Hensley read them aloud to Yamada, who muttered something in Japanese under his breath. "What was that?" Hensley asked. "A proverb," Yamada replied. "It means, the bird that sings in the cage forgets the storm outside." The next morning, the women packed their few belongings. Some folded their camp-issued dresses carefully. Others left them behind, as if to deny the sentiment that had softened them. Aiko slipped her sister's letter into her coat pocket. She traced the address one last time, knowing it might no longer exist. When the trucks arrived, Mrs. Callahan came to say goodbye. She handed each woman a small paper envelope filled with seeds. "Plant these when you go home," she said. "Something must grow again." They bowed deeply, their eyes glistening with gratitude too complex for words. As they climbed into the trucks, Aiko turned back toward the barracks, her voice low but clear. "America was kind," she said to no one in particular. "That is why it hurts." The engine started, coughing clouds of gray smoke into the cold air. Hensley raised his hand in farewell. The women waved back, faces streaked with tears, clutching their letters like relics. The convoy rolled toward the train station, wheels hissing on wet gravel. As the camp disappeared behind them, Aiko reached into her pocket and touched her sister's letter. The paper felt damp with her sweat, fragile but still whole. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm coming home." But deep down, she wasn't sure which side of the ocean that word belonged to anymore. Fog rolled in over the San Francisco Bay like a ghost that had forgotten how to leave. The women stood on the pier in their ill-fitting coats, clutching small suitcases and paper bundles tied with twine. The ship before them, painted gray, still bearing the faded insignia of the U.S. Army Transport Service, waited with its engines humming softly, a mechanical heartbeat against the water. On its hull, someone had stenciled the words "Return Voyage." To the Americans on the dock, it was closure. To the women, it was exile. Aiko stared at the water, its surface trembling in the morning light. She had dreamed of Japan for so long that she no longer trusted the image her mind conjured. Was it still a homeland if she feared it? Around her, the others whispered quietly in Japanese, their voices rising and falling like waves. Some held rosaries gifted by local churchwomen. Others tucked small bags of Kansas soil into their pockets, a keepsake of a land they had never planned to love. Captain Hensley stood near the loading ramp, clipboard in hand. His uniform was pressed, his expression unreadable. Yet behind the bureaucratic posture lingered something else, guilt, perhaps, or affection he could not name. Each time a name was called, a piece of him recoiled. These women had become more than names. They were voices at mealtime, laughter during storms, faces he now saw in his sleep. When Aiko's turn came, she stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Thank you, Captain," she said in careful English. "For everything." He nodded stiffly. "You'll be all right, Miss Aiko." She hesitated. "In Japan, no home. No sister maybe. But I will try." Her smile was small but defiant. He wanted to answer, to say something human, but all that came out was, "Safe journey." She boarded without looking back. As the ship began to fill, Mrs. Callahan appeared at the end of the dock, her coat buttoned to the neck, holding a wicker basket. She had come alone, against her doctor's advice, walking with the slow dignity of someone whose grief had become endurance. Inside the basket were wrapped loaves of bread, one for each woman. "For the road home," she said when Hensley met her halfway. Her voice trembled. They shouldn't go hungry in the land of plenty. He carried the basket aboard himself. When the women saw her on the pier, they pressed their hands against their hearts. Some wept openly. The ship's horn bellowed, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the air and into the bones. Ropes were cast off, gulls scattered, and slowly the vessel began to drift from the dock. The women stood at the rail, their faces ghostly in the fog. Mrs. Callahan waved her handkerchief until the outlines of their silhouettes dissolved into mist. The voyage lasted nearly 3 weeks. Days were spent in uneasy quiet, the ocean stretching endlessly on every side. The crew treated the passengers kindly but distantly, aware that these women were neither prisoners nor guests, something in between. They were allowed to walk the deck, though few did. Aiko often sat near the stern, staring at the horizon as if expecting the Pacific itself to offer a decision. On the 7th day, a sailor handed her a small envelope addressed simply, "From Camp Kansas." Inside was a letter written in a firm, careful hand. "Dear Miss Aiko, the garden is still growing. The spring rain came early, and the seeds you planted have sprouted. I think of you often and hope the soil remembers your hands. W.H." She folded the note carefully and pressed it against her chest. For the first time since leaving, she smiled. When Japan finally appeared, dark shapes of coastline under a cloudy sky, the women crowded the railings. But as the ship neared Yokohama harbor, silence fell. The docks were broken, the cranes skeletal. Black smoke rose from factories still half in ruins. The smell of ash and salt filled the air. Children scavenged among piles of rubble, their faces hollow and gray. The women exchanged glances. This was not the home they had carried in their dreams. Aiko disembarked slowly, her suitcase light, her stomach heavier than ever. American officials guided them to a processing tent, where they were questioned, registered, and handed ration tickets. The interpreters were efficient but cold. When asked her destination, Aiko said softly, "No home. I will find work." The clerk nodded without sympathy. Many say the same. That night, she slept in a shelter with other returnees. Rain leaked through the roof, pooling in shallow bowls they set beneath the drip. Someone began humming a familiar tune, "You Are My Sunshine." It drifted softly through the dark, stitched together by memory and longing. Aiko joined in, her voice breaking halfway through. Days turned into weeks. She searched for her sister, visiting church basements and Red Cross lists, but Keiko's name was never found. Eventually, Aiko found work at an American relief office translating letters for food distribution. The irony wasn't lost on her, serving the country that had fed her while translating pleas from her own people. Yet in the rhythm of the words, she found purpose. "You have a gentle way with language," her supervisor told her. "Maybe that's your gift." One afternoon, as she sorted mail, she came across an envelope bearing an American postmark. Her heart stuttered. The return address read Topeka, Kansas. Inside was a photograph, a field of blooming flowers where the barracks once stood. A note in familiar handwriting accompanied it. The fighting accompanied it. "The fence is gone. But the garden remains. Thought you'd want to know." It was signed simply, Walter. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the edges of the image. The flowers looked like laughter frozen in color. That night, she wrote back. "Tell the garden I remember. Tell it I am trying to grow again, even in the ashes." She sealed the letter and whispered into the envelope, "Thank you," before dropping it into the post bag. Years passed. The world moved forward, layering new wars over old ones, new names over forgotten graves. But Aiko kept the photo close, tucking it beside her sister's last letter. She taught English at a small school, where she began each class by writing one word on the chalkboard: hope. Her students thought it was a lesson in vocabulary. She knew it was survival. Decades later, long after Kansas had become a memory with edges softened by time, she returned. The camp was gone, replaced by farmland and wildflowers. Only a rusted gate remained, leaning at an angle like an old scar. She knelt beside it, pressing her palm into the soil. The ground was warm, alive. "This is where I learned kindness," she whispered. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wheat and rain. For a moment she thought she heard voices, the laughter of women, the rustle of paper, the echo of a promise. She smiled through her tears. Freedom, she realized, was not a place. It was the quiet courage to begin again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood, brushing dust from her skirt. The field shimmered gold in the fading light. She looked east, toward the distant ocean she had once crossed, and murmured, "I am finally home." Then, softly, as if to an unseen listener, she added, "And I never truly left." If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to Prairie Tales, and tell us in the comments, what does freedom mean to you? Because sometimes the greatest mercy in war is the kindness that outlives it.